How you could have survived the Black Plague. The Black Death of the 14th century wiped out about 1/3 of Europe's population. As a result, only about half of the people you could have met back then would have survived it. So, what were your odds? Could you have survived this plague? In this video, we'll talk about some basic factors that would have influenced your chances and how you could have prevented yourself from getting sick in the future. So watch the video till the end and don't forget to like and subscribe. In the 14th century, a new and terrifying disease erupted from Central Asia. It was called the Black Plague, and it killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe alone. This disease was the deadliest in human history. It killed about 60% of Europe's population. When your neighbor started coughing up blood and died, you would have assumed that he or she had been cursed by God for their sins. However, this wasn't the case. The Black Plague was a bacterial infection called Yersinia pestis that spread from fleas to rats to humans. Since nobody knew how it was transmitted or how to prevent it, no one could have avoided it completely. It was spread by fleas living in the fur of rats, and it wasn't known to be contagious. The bacteria could only be passed on by flea bites. The plague also wasn't known to spread through human contact with live patients or even their dead bodies. Now let's come to our main topic of the video, that is, how you could have survived the Black Plague. First of all, you have to overcome grief. There are few things more devastating than losing a loved one to the plague. The feeling of hopelessness and despair that comes with having your loved one taken from you is enough to plunge anyone into a pit of despair. However, if you let grief overwhelm you, it will be harder to survive the plague and make it out alive. It's important not to let yourself become distracted by your grief or neglect your responsibilities because of it. You need to keep going and remember that there are other things in life besides grieving over lost loved ones. If you don't have anything else left in life outside of mourning them, then there isn't really much point in trying to live through this difficult time at all. The Black Death was spread by fleas that lived in the fur of rats. The Black Death was spread by fleas that lived in the fur of rats. The most common carriers were black rats, which are not native to Europe, Africa, or the Americas. Black rats were brought to Europe from Asia via trade routes and then spread throughout Italy, France, and Spain during the 14th century. The only way you could have been immune is if you were born before the first major outbreak or if your family had never been exposed to it before you were born. For example, if they had no family members who lived in Europe. If you were born outside of Europe, you have a much better chance of surviving the Black Death than someone who was born in Europe. Why? It all comes down to where people lived during this time period. If you lived in a city instead of the countryside, there's a good chance that you would have gotten sick with the plague and died. Cities were crowded and dirty, which made them ideal breeding grounds for rats and fleas that carried the disease. Those living in rural areas had fewer chances of being exposed to infected fleas because they didn't live among many other people or animals, and because their homes weren't surrounded by garbage dumps filled with rats carrying the disease. If you were to survive the plague, it would be essential to use types of soap that contained oil or mercury. These soaps were used in everything from cleaning your body to your clothing, your home, and even the streets. Oil-based soaps are effective at killing germs because they contain fatty acids, which kill bacteria by dissolving their cell walls. Mercury has been used for centuries as an antifungal agent in medicine and as a preservative for food products. It will kill bacteria and fungi on contact when used in the form of silver nitrate or calomel, mercurous chloride. Wear a mask on your nose and mouth to protect against evil air. A mask is a barrier that stops germs from getting into your mouth and nose. You can make one out of cloth. First, cut out 2 circles of fabric, or use pre-made ones that are big enough to cover the areas around your mouth and nose. The larger size will help keep them firmly in place. Next, fold over each circle so that it covers everything but your eyes, with some overlap at the bottom of each circle to hold them together. Tie them off with a string or piece of cloth so you don't lose them during use. Purge yourself when sick. If you're sick, it's best to purge yourself so that you may recover. Purging the body will help cleanse your system of toxins and help get rid of any illness that may be in your body at the time. Drinking lots of water and eating lots of vegetables, fruit juice, and fruit can help you feel better faster by flushing out bad things inside. Drinking milk or eating meat will also aid in recovery by providing protein for rebuilding muscle tissue or other tissues needed during recovery. Drinking alcohol or eating bread will provide the energy needed for recuperation after purging has taken place. Stayed away from cats. You could have survived the Black Death by staying away from cats. Cats were considered to be symbols of wealth, and they were kept indoors in wealthy homes. They were also kept as pets in these settings, but this was not the case for most people in the countryside. Cats were considered pests because they ate other animals' food, so it was unusual for them to be kept as pets outside of cities or towns. If you were a woman, there's a good chance you would have survived the Black Death. This is because women were less likely to be infected by the disease than their male counterparts. One reason for this is that men traveled more often and in greater numbers than women did, on average. When men traveled, they carried diseases with them and spread them around their destinations. Women, on the other hand, tended not to travel as often or as far from home when they did so. It may seem like an unfair advantage given that most people didn't survive anyhow, but it's better than nothing. Another reason for this gender discrepancy was trade. Many merchants and traders died during this time period because of their involvement in trade, which required constant movement. Men made up 90% of all merchants during this era, and most of those who survived ended up dying anyway, simply because they'd come into contact with so many others who already had been infected before heading back home again. Women also had better resistance to the disease, and their bodies could fight it more easily. If you were a woman who was married, you also had an advantage as your husband would take care of you and nurse you back to health if infected. And if by chance he did get sick, he would be less likely to succumb because his immune system was stronger than yours, and therefore his chances of surviving were greater. What about young children? Did they survive? Very few did, but those who did generally turned out fine as adults. The older generation did even better during this time period, especially those over 70 years old, since their immune systems had plenty of experience fighting off similar diseases throughout their lives, thus giving them a better chance at survival when faced with this particular strain, or so we assume. Do not breathe through your mouth. The Black Death was a bacterial infection that spread from person to person. It was not a virus, so there was no vaccine or cure. The bacteria were carried by fleas and transmitted to the lungs of people when they breathed in the bacteria through their mouths and noses. The best way to avoid breathing in these dangerous germs would have been to breathe through your nose instead of your mouth, which would avoid contact with contaminated air. Eat large amounts of onions. No matter how dire the situation, there are always a few things you can do to help yourself stay healthy. One of these is eating lots of onions. Onions are rich in quercetin, a powerful antioxidant which has been shown to reduce inflammation in the lungs. It's also found in apples, red wine, and tea. So if you have any of those on hand and have access to water, they may be worth trying instead. Be rich. If you were rich, you would be more likely to have access to good food and medicine. You would also be living in a better environment than the poor, who could not afford clean water or decent sanitation. Good doctors were expensive and only available to those who could pay for them. If you had money, it was more likely that you could get one of these higher quality doctors who knew what they were doing. Now, you might have been lucky. Luck is a factor in survival. It can be defined as a combination of skill, opportunity, and circumstances. Luck is not the same as chance or skill. Luck is what happens when good things happen to you that you don't deserve or earn by your own actions. If you were lucky during the Black Death, then it was probably because your parents had enough money to send you away for treatment, and if they didn't have any money left over for this purpose, chances are that they were dead anyway, or perhaps there was an outbreak of another disease somewhere else in Europe. Maybe the plague came from Asia by boat and hit England first before moving on to France? If so, then maybe everyone who lived near where the plague started died before reaching London and infecting more people there? If you survived, you were immune and therefore necessary to the survival of others. You were a survivor, and as such, your descendants would also be survivors. In a way, this was a form of evolution for humans. Those who had the ability to survive would continue on in their offspring, while those who did not would perish from lack of food or water. As time went on and more people died out due to the plague, there were fewer people left alive who had not been exposed yet. People became less susceptible over time because they had already been infected with the Yersinia pestis several times before, but never got sick from it due to their immunity. They would have developed antibodies against Yersinia pestis over time, since many bacteria cause similar symptoms when contracted by healthy individuals, like fever. So, Could you have survived the plague? The answer is yes and maybe. Honestly, if we're being real with ourselves, survival was more luck than anything else. We know everything now that the people of that time didn't, so our odds are better, but there's no guarantee. The plague killed 75 million people in Europe between 1347 and 1400, making it one of the worst pandemics ever recorded in human history. Today, we're living through another deadly pandemic called COVID-19 that has already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives around the world. Just like with the Black Death and every other deadly disease, our best bet to stop transmission is still what it always has been: education about how diseases spread and prevention techniques like hand washing or wearing masks when we can't practice social distancing from others. Thanks for watching! We hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot about the Black Plague, one of the deadliest diseases in history. If you liked this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time!